These cars weren't just ugly or unreliable, they were dangerous, and some of them left a trail of lawsuits, injuries, and even deaths in their wake. Here are 9 of the most dangerously botched American cars that deserve a place in infamy. You won't believe how real and how reckless they actually were.
Dear viewer, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for your support.
Number 9, the 1971 Ford Torino. While the Torino is sometimes remembered for its muscle car styling and strong V8 options, it is equally important to evaluate it for what it lacked, namely crash protection, braking competence, and driver safety. The Torino was large, powerful, and impressive on paper, but when it came to real-world driving dynamics and passenger protection, it fell short in some critical ways. Ford positioned the Torino as a mid-size car, though by today's standards, and even by 1971's, its dimensions pushed it closer to full-size territory. The Torino was offered in several body styles, including 2-door coupes, 4-door sedans, and station wagons, and it came with a broad array of engines from a basic inline-6 to monstrous 429 cubic-inch V8s. On the surface, it appeared to be a solid American family car, or muscle machine depending on trim, but underneath it revealed a series of engineering compromises that made it questionable in terms of safety and roadworthiness. Let's start with one of the most pressing concerns: braking distance. The 1971 Torino was a heavy car, often exceeding 3,800 pounds, especially with a V8 engine and optional features. This mass severely impacted its ability to stop quickly in emergency situations. Front disc brakes were available, but not always standard. Many lower trim models came with all-drum brake setups, which were notorious for fading under heat and stress, particularly during repeated stops or downhill driving. Brake fade on long descents or during panic braking was a real risk. Once the drums overheated, the braking power decreased dramatically, potentially leading to loss of control or rear-end collisions. Even with disc brakes, the stopping distance for a fully loaded Torino at highway speeds could exceed that of smaller, lighter cars by dozens of feet, enough to cause or fail to avoid an accident. The 1971 Torino was not built with agility in mind. It had a soft, comfort-tuned suspension designed more for cruising than carving corners. Body roll was substantial, especially in the 4-door and wagon variants. This made high-speed cornering or emergency lane changes unsettling and potentially hazardous. The steering was vague and often required considerable input to make modest course corrections. On the highway, this could translate into delayed response during evasive maneuvers. In wet or slick conditions, the rear-wheel drive layout combined with poor weight distribution meant the rear end could break loose without much warning. Oversteering in slippery turns was not uncommon, particularly in V8 models where torque easily overwhelmed the rear tires. All of these factors combined to make the Torino sluggish, slow to respond, and unpredictable in emergency handling situations. In terms of passive safety, the 1971 Ford Torino reflects a troubling era of American automotive design, where performance and styling were often prioritized over occupant protection. The 1971 Torino lacked reinforced side structures, making side impact crashes especially dangerous. In a T-bone collision, the doors could collapse inward, severely injuring the occupants. Crumple zones were largely non-existent. The structure of the vehicle was rigid and transferred most of the crash energy directly to the passengers. The steering column was not of the modern energy-absorbing variety in all models, increasing the risk of chest or head injuries in frontal collisions. Many models were still equipped with lap-only seatbelts, especially in rear seating positions. These provided minimal protection in rollovers or high-speed crashes. Even in the front seats, shoulder belts were sometimes omitted or poorly designed, loose, awkward to wear, and rarely used by occupants. The Torino also lacked any form of airbags, which wouldn't become common until much later, and there were no pretensioners or load limiters on the belts that were installed. The 1971 Torino had a relatively high center of gravity, particularly in wagon and high-trim V8 versions. Combined with soft suspension, it made the vehicle more prone to rollover accidents during sharp evasive maneuvers or loss of control. The roof structure offered limited rollover protection. In a rollover, the pillars could collapse, putting passengers at risk of head or spinal injuries. Unlike modern cars, which are built to withstand roof crush scenarios, the Torino's frame was not reinforced for vertical load, a structural flaw that could prove fatal in the event of a rollover. To sum up, the 1971 Ford Torino represents a car from an era where style and engine size often came at the expense of driver control and passenger safety. With poor braking, sluggish handling, outdated restraint systems, and inadequate crash protection, the Torino posed real dangers, especially in the unpredictable situations that demand fast thinking and fast responses. Number 8, the 1970s. The 1976 AMC Matador Coupe. This car was striking to look at, there's no doubt about that, but beneath its dramatic design lay a set of engineering and safety issues that made it unwieldy, underperforming, and ultimately hazardous to operate in real-world conditions. Let's examine the Matador Coupe not just as a failed design experiment, but as a case study in how poor visibility, excessive mass, and under-engineering can turn a car into a rolling liability. AMC introduced the Matador Coupe in 1974 as a replacement for the Rebel, with the 1976 model being one of its final iterations. The coupe stood out from the sedan and wagon versions by having a completely different, swooping fuselage body with a long hood, sloped rear, and bulging fenders, designed more for flair than function. AMC was attempting to chase personal luxury coupe buyers in the same market as the Chevrolet Monte Carlo and Ford Thunderbird. But while its competitors worked to balance looks with functionality, AMC leaned hard into style, to the detriment of handling, visibility, and overall safety. Perhaps the most immediately dangerous aspect of the 1976 Matador Coupe was its horrible outward visibility, especially to the rear and rear quarter angles. The fastback roofline and high rear deck created a massive blind spot. This made lane changes, reversing, and parking hazardous, especially in urban environments. The thick C-pillars not only blocked sightlines, but also reduced the driver's situational awareness, a critical issue during emergency maneuvers or evasive driving. Rear-view mirrors alone could not compensate, and no convex or supplemental mirrors were provided by default. For a car this size and shape, that was a serious oversight. While the Matador Coupe looked sleek, it was anything but light. The 1976 version could tip the scales at nearly 4,000 pounds, depending on the options chosen. That weight was disproportionately distributed with a heavy front end, thanks to large V8 engine options, and a relatively light, sweeping rear. This made the car nose-heavy, reducing cornering confidence and increasing understeer. Emergency handling, especially on wet or uneven roads, became a serious challenge. The car tended to plow forward rather than turn, and correcting mid-corner was often futile. Combined with overboosted power steering that provided little road feel, drivers found themselves detached from the car's actual movement, increasing the odds of overcorrection or delayed response. One of the Matador Coupe's most alarming weaknesses was its under-braked chassis. Despite its mass, the 1976 model came with small front disc brakes and rear drums, which were simply not up to the task of stopping such a large vehicle quickly or repeatedly. Brake fade was common after a few hard stops, whether in traffic or descending a grade. Once overheated, the brakes lost efficiency dramatically. Emergency stopping distances were long and inconsistent. Reports from road testers of the time showed that the Matador required considerably more road to stop than its competitors, especially when fully loaded. AMC tuned the Matador for comfort, not control, and the result was a floaty, unpredictable ride. Body roll was excessive even in gentle corners. A quick turn could cause the car to lean alarmingly, throwing passengers off balance and upsetting the vehicle's weight distribution. The suspension lacked refinement, relying on soft springs and primitive dampers that could not properly manage the car's mass. Steering was vague, with a delay between input and response that made the car feel slow to react, especially dangerous during highway lane changes or obstacle avoidance. The Matador had a tendency to porpoise over uneven roads, with the front and rear bouncing out of sync, further reducing driver confidence. By 1976, federal regulations had begun pushing car makers to improve crash protection, but the Matador lagged behind in several areas. Side impact protection was minimal. There were no door beams or reinforcements in early models, meaning a T-bone collision could easily intrude into the passenger cabin. The steering column was not fully collapsible in all trims, meaning frontal collisions could result in serious injury to the driver. Seatbelt technology was outdated, and many drivers still only used lap belts. There were no airbags or advanced restraints. The large, heavy hood and fenders had no crumple zones, meaning crash energy was poorly absorbed and often transferred directly into the cabin. To conclude, the 1976 AMC Matador Coupe was a bold visual experiment that failed to deliver where it mattered most: driver control, passenger safety, and structural competence. In emergency situations, its flaws were amplified. Poor brakes, unpredictable handling, and abysmal visibility worked together to make this car not only difficult to drive, but actively dangerous in critical moments. Number 7, the 1973 Chevrolet Vega, a car that General Motors hoped would compete with small imports, but instead earned a lasting reputation for rust, mechanical failure, and crash vulnerability. In this lecture, we'll unpack the Vega's most infamous flaws, particularly in regard to crash safety, engine reliability, thermal issues, and braking failures, and discuss how this compact car managed to become one of the most dangerous and disappointing vehicles of its time. The Vega was introduced in 1970 as Chevrolet's bold entry into the growing subcompact market. It was marketed as a stylish, affordable, and efficient car, the little car that does everything well. However, by 1973, the flaws in the Vega's execution had become clear. Instead of innovation, it became synonymous with premature rust, catastrophic engine problems, structural fragility, unstable handling, unreliable braking. Let's begin with its physical construction. The unit body frame was light and thin. While this contributed to better fuel economy, it lacked the structural integrity needed for real-world collisions. In crash tests and real accidents, the body crumpled easily. Side impact protection was non-existent. Thin door panels offered little resistance in a T-bone scenario, and there were no reinforced beams. The front end lacked true crumple zones, and in a head-on collision, energy transfer often went straight into the passenger compartment. The steering column, while slightly improved over older designs, could still impale the driver in high-speed impacts due to poor energy absorption. Consumer reports in the mid-1970s referred to the Vega's crash performance as alarming when compared to similarly priced competitors. Moving on to braking, something any car must do well to be considered safe. The Vega had small front disc brakes and rear drums, which were undersized even by compact car standards. Under sustained braking, such as during downhill descents or in stop-and-go traffic, brake fade was common. The brakes would heat up, and stopping distances would increase dramatically. There were numerous complaints about pedal softness and brake imbalance, especially when the car was loaded with passengers. In emergency situations, this inconsistency could turn a manageable situation into a crash, and GM never fully addressed the issue during the Vega's production run. The Vega's engine was arguably its most infamous flaw, particularly due to thermal and reliability issues. GM designed a 2.3-liter aluminum inline-4 engine with an iron cylinder head. While aluminum offered weight savings, the lack of cylinder liners and poor heat management led to rapid wear. The engine was prone to overheating, which warped the aluminum block and head. This resulted in coolant leaks, head gasket failure, and eventual catastrophic failure. The cooling system itself was inadequate, particularly the radiator and thermostat, which struggled to keep the engine within safe temperatures under load. Once the engine overheated, it often seized or cracked internally, making repairs either expensive or completely impractical for low-income buyers. These problems led to thousands of warranty claims and early engine replacements, damaging GM's reputation and consumer trust. Though not directly related to crash performance, rust turned the Vega into a rolling safety hazard over time. The 1973 Vega, like its predecessors, was built with thin-gauge steel that was poorly treated against corrosion. GM skipped traditional rust-proofing to save cost and weight. The car was infamous for rusting through in as little as 1 to 2 years, particularly in the fenders, rocker panels, and floor pans. Some models experience rust holes before 30,000 miles, making the structural integrity of the body even worse than when new. In northern states where salt was used on the roads, the Vega could disintegrate from underneath, with control arms, suspension mounts, and even seat mounts weakening or separating due to corrosion. By the time many Vegas made it to 5 years of age, they were often already unsafe just from rust-induced degradation alone. Adding insult to injury, the 1973 Vega was notorious for poor assembly quality. Doors misaligned, trim pieces fell off. Electrical systems failed early. Seatbelt mechanisms jammed or failed to retract. Windows were prone to coming off track. All of these issues compounded the safety concerns. Imagine trying to exit the vehicle after a crash, only to find the door handle broken or jammed. For a car marketed to the budget-conscious commuter, these weren't just annoyances. They could be life-threatening. Number 6, the 1952 Hudson Wasp. Though admired for its sleek design and low profile, the Wasp concealed a number of serious safety shortcomings that made it hazardous in real-world driving conditions. This lecture will focus on the car's lack of structural crash protection, weak body rigidity, poor safety restraint systems, and how these elements combine to make the Wasp dangerous in collisions, even at moderate speeds. To understand the Wasp's shortcomings, we first need to discuss Hudson's design philosophy. Hudson was one of the more forward-thinking independent automakers in the late 1940s and early 1950s. The step-down chassis, introduced in 1948, allowed passengers to sit lower within the frame of the car, theoretically improving handling and safety. By 1952, the Wasp adopted this same platform, a lower center of gravity and a more modern profile compared to its taller, slab-sided competitors. However, this design brought problems. The monocoque-like structure may have improved cornering, but it also lacked reinforcement in key areas, especially along the sides and roof. In serious crashes, the body could crumple, buckle, or deform, offering minimal protection to occupants. Unlike modern unibody designs that are engineered with computer-tested crumple zones, the 1952 Wasp's body had very little torsional strength. Side impact protection was virtually non-existent. The doors were thin and poorly braced. Roof pillars were slim, which looked stylish but added very little rollover strength. In a T-bone crash, the side structure would collapse inward, and in a rollover, the roof could easily cave in. The car may have handled better than most 1952 sedans thanks to its low stance, but that didn't translate to crash survivability. Another major safety concern was the absence of seat belts. Most 1952 Hudson Wasp models were delivered without seat belts at all. At the time, seat belts were not federally mandated or even commonly expected. If seat belts were installed at the buyer's request, they were lap-only belts, which did very little to prevent injury during a frontal collision. In a crash, the driver and front passenger were often thrown forward into the dashboard or steering column. Rear passengers became projectiles, increasing the risk of fatal injuries to everyone inside. The lack of three-point restraints or even padded dashboards meant that a 30-mile-per-hour collision could easily result in serious trauma or death. Like many cars of its era, the 1952 Hudson Wasp used a rigid steering column. There was no collapsible shaft and no breakaway design to absorb impact. In the event of a frontal collision, the steering column would shove rearward into the driver's chest, causing massive internal injuries or even instant death. This problem plagued many 1950s vehicles, but in the Wasp it was especially troubling due to the lack of front-end crash structure to absorb and dissipate energy. Safety isn't just about surviving a crash, it's about avoiding one. The 1952 Wasp used four-wheel drum brakes, which were prone to brake fade during prolonged or emergency use. The braking distances were long, and under wet conditions, the drums could lock up unevenly, reducing control. Tires were bias ply, not radials, and had less grip and stability, particularly in corners or emergency maneuvers. This meant that avoiding a crash in the first place was a challenge, especially at highway speeds. Another underestimated issue, visibility. The Wasp had a low-slung roofline and a large C-pillar, which created pronounced blind spots, particularly when backing up or changing lanes. Mirror coverage was minimal, with only a single side mirror on most models and a small interior rearview mirror. This not only increased the risk of lane change and intersection accidents, but also made urban driving more hazardous, where peripheral awareness is essential. By today's standards, the 1952 Hudson Wasp is a rolling death trap. No crumple zones, no airbags, no reinforced cabin structure, no advanced restraints, poor handling, braking, and visibility. Even in its own time, it was behind the curve when compared to emerging innovations from companies like Volvo, which had begun promoting seat belts and crash survivability by the late 1950s, while the Wasp was stylish and advanced in some ways. Particularly with its step-down design, it ultimately placed aesthetics and brand identity over occupant safety. Number 5, the 1970 Buick Electra 225, one of the longest and most imposing full-size American sedans of its era. Though it was marketed as a symbol of luxury, comfort, and road presence, the Electra 225 also suffered from serious shortcomings in safety, handling, and braking, particularly when operated in the real-world conditions of urban and highway driving. This lecture will cover the Electra's massive dimensions and poor maneuverability, braking and steering limitations, how its size exacerbated risk in emergency situations, and the broader implications for large American sedans of the early 1970s. Let's start with the elephant in the garage, the size. The 1970 Buick Electra 225 measured nearly 19.25 feet long, 231.9 inches, longer than many pickup trucks. Curb weight hovered around 4,600 pounds depending on equipment. Width exceeded 79 inches, making it difficult to park, maneuver, or navigate in tighter city environments. The sheer bulk made the Electra a challenge to operate in crowded urban areas. Tight U-turns? Nearly impossible. Parallel parking? A stressful ordeal. Even suburban driveways strained to accommodate it. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It posed a real safety hazard in quick response situations. Despite its massive footprint, the Electra came with overly light, power-assisted steering that was notoriously vague. The steering box had significant play, leading to delayed directional response. On the highway, especially at speeds above 50 miles per hour, the Electra had a tendency to float or wander within a lane. Emergency maneuvers, such as swerving to avoid an obstacle, were unpredictable and difficult to control. The steering system prioritized comfort over precision. That might have made for a relaxed ride, but it undermined driver control, particularly when it mattered most. Given its mass, the Electra 225 needed serious stopping power. Unfortunately, what it had wasn't enough. Front disc brakes were optional. Many 1970 models still came with four-wheel drum brakes, which suffered from brake fade under repeated use, poor performance in wet conditions, inconsistent pedal feel. Even with disc brakes, braking distances were alarmingly long, especially when fully loaded with passengers and luggage. At 60 miles per hour, it often took well over 160 feet to come to a complete stop, an unsafe distance when sudden hazards emerge. The Electra 225 was designed for maximum ride comfort, but this came at a cost. The car used soft coil spring suspension, tuned to absorb bumps, not carve corners. This created a floaty, disconnected driving experience, especially at highway speeds or on winding roads. Excessive body roll and turns made cornering feel unstable, while weight transfer during braking caused nosediving. In short, the Electra didn't just feel like a boat, it handled like one. In 1970, safety features were still minimal on most American cars, and the Electra was no exception. No airbags, no anti-lock brakes, no crumple zones or reinforced cabin structure. Seat belts were lap belts only, and often ignored by drivers and passengers alike. The steering column was not yet energy absorbing, and dashboards were hard plastic or metal, making collisions even more dangerous. One might assume that a massive car like the Electra would be inherently safer due to its bulk, but in reality, the long wheelbase and nose-heavy weight distribution meant poor agility and understeer in evasive maneuvers. If a crash did occur, the high mass translated into greater impact forces, which affected both the occupants and anyone hit by the car. Pedestrian accidents were especially severe due to the high, flat front end with little energy absorption. The Electra 225 was not alone. Many full-size American cars of the era shared its flaws, but the Electra's extreme length and soft handling made it a poster child for oversized, under-engineered luxury. It wouldn't be until the fuel crises of the 70s, mid-1970s, and increased federal safety regulations that cars began shrinking and improving in structural design. In retrospect, the Electra 225 is a symbol of an era when comfort and presence took precedence over driver control and safety, an imbalance that left many vehicles ill-equipped for real-world driving demands. Number 4, the 1951 Kaiser Deluxe. Though it was admired for its sleek look, aerodynamic profile, and upscale features, it also represented a time when vehicle safety was nearly non-existent in both concept and execution. This lecture will break down the design and engineering of the Kaiser Deluxe, why it was structurally vulnerable, the absence of key safety features, and how it reflected the broader neglect of occupant protection in early 1950s automotive design. Let's start with what the 1951 Kaiser Deluxe got right, at least visually and conceptually. It was designed with streamlined, envelope-style bodywork, unlike the boxier Big Three competitors. The front end featured a distinctive heart-shaped grille, a hallmark of post-war optimism. Inside, it had a well-finished interior, and Kaiser's advertising often emphasized space and comfort. It even offered two-tone paint jobs, tinted glass, and luxurious upholstery, modern touches for the time. In terms of appearance and innovation, the Kaiser Deluxe looked like the future, but that's where the forward thinking stopped. In 1951, crash safety wasn't yet part of automotive engineering. The focus was still on styling, horsepower, and passenger comfort. Unfortunately, this left the Kaiser Deluxe and its peers with serious vulnerabilities. No reinforced safety cell. The car's passenger compartment lacked a structural cage or any form of energy-absorbing architecture. No crumple zones. The body was rigid in all the wrong ways, meaning impacts transferred directly to occupants. No safety glass on all windows. While the windshield might have had laminated glass, side and rear windows often shattered dangerously. No seat belts, not even optional. Simply put, this was a car designed to look good, rolling down the boulevard, not one built to protect you in a crash. One of the most dangerous aspects of the 1951 Kaiser Deluxe was its thin side doors and weak roofline. The doors were lightweight and prone to buckling under side impact, offering minimal intrusion protection. The door latches were not designed to stay closed during a collision, meaning doors could fly open in a crash. The roof lacked internal bracing, which posed a major risk in rollovers. It could collapse like a tin can under the weight of the car. Even a relatively low-speed rollover or side impact could cause catastrophic structural failure, turning the interior into a death trap. The interior of the Kaiser Deluxe was, like most cars of the time, a danger zone in a collision. The steering column was rigid and directly aligned with the driver's chest, creating a deadly spear effect in frontal crashes. Dashboard materials were made of hard metal with no padding. In an impact, heads and knees would slam into solid steel. Sharp knobs, chrome accents, and non-collapsible components made the interior a minefield during sudden stops. Occupants essentially rode in a mobile sculpture. Beautiful but unforgiving. Safety isn't just about crash-worthiness. It's also about avoiding the crash in the first place. Here, the Kaiser Deluxe struggled too. Brakes were non-power assisted drums, which faded quickly and required significant force to be effective. Bias ply tires had poor grip, especially in wet conditions. The suspension was soft, giving it a comfortable ride but terrible cornering stability. It would lean heavily in turns, raising the risk of rollovers or loss of control. In emergency situations, the Kaiser Deluxe was slow to stop and hard to steer, a deadly combination. It's important to remember that Kaiser Frazer was not alone. All major automakers of the early 1950s ignored crash protection. The public didn't demand safety features. There were no federal standards or regulations yet in place. Manufacturers feared that emphasizing safety would imply their cars were dangerous. A marketing no-go. Kaiser's focus was on style and value, not survival. That mindset wouldn't begin to shift until the late 1950s and 1960s, after mounting public pressure and high-profile tragedies forced change. The 1951 Kaiser Deluxe was a stylish and progressive vehicle in appearance, but one deeply rooted in outdated safety thinking. It was an unfortunate byproduct of an industry focused on glamour over responsibility. In hindsight, its vulnerabilities included no crash protection structure, thin, flexible body panels, fragile roof and side impact exposure, dangerous interior design, subpar control systems. It may have helped Kaiser stand out briefly in a crowded post-war market, but from a modern engineering perspective, the Deluxe was a rolling risk. Number 3, the 1972 Dodge Polara. This car epitomized the era's obsession with size, comfort, and soft rides, but at a steep cost in terms of vehicle safety and control. While it offered the image of strength and dominance on the road, under the surface it was plagued with engineering compromises that made it a high-risk vehicle under real-world driving conditions. From its sloppy suspension to its inefficient braking and rollover-prone handling, the Polara serves as a warning about how misplaced priorities in car design can jeopardize driver and passenger safety. By 1972, Dodge, like other American automakers, had fully embraced the trend of massive land yachts. The Polara was one of Chrysler's full-sized offerings and sat below the Dodge Monaco in the lineup. At over 18 feet long and more than 4,400 pounds, the Polara was an enormous vehicle even by 1970s standards. Buyers were drawn to its wide, floating ride and upscale image, but this came at a severe cost to maneuverability and control. It was built on the C-body platform, known for its bulk but not for its precision or safety. The Polara was marketed as a family car that could go cross-country in comfort, but few buyers understood how poorly it would handle under stress. One of the most immediate problems with the 1972 Polara was its sloppy, underdamped suspension. Dodge softened the springs and shocks for a smoother ride, a common decision at the time, but this made the car wallow in turns. The Polara had significant body roll, especially when loaded with passengers or cargo. In emergency maneuvers like swerving to avoid a hazard, the rear end could easily become unstable, increasing the risk of spin-outs or even rollovers. It was a car designed to cruise, not to handle, and when pushed even modestly, it could become dangerously unpredictable. Stopping a car of the Polara's size required serious braking power, which it simply didn't have. Four-wheel drum brakes were still standard on many models, and even when front disc brakes were available, they were often optional. Drum brakes faded quickly under repeated use, especially downhill or in wet conditions. This meant the Polara had long stopping distances, especially when loaded, and brake performance degraded rapidly under stress. In panic stops, the driver often had to fight the car's weight and outdated hardware, with inconsistent results. Driving the 1972 Polara felt like piloting a boat, and visibility reflected that. The thick rear pillars and long hood made it difficult to judge where the car ended. Backing up or navigating tight city spaces was a challenge, even for experienced drivers. Combined with vague steering, this lack of visibility amplified the danger in close quarters or during quick maneuvers. The Polara's bulk isolated the driver from the environment, which felt luxurious until you needed awareness, like merging or navigating tight traffic. One of the most alarming aspects of the Polara's handling was its increased risk of rollover. With a high center of gravity and a soft suspension, the Polara leaned heavily in corners. During quick lane changes or evasive swerves, especially at highway speeds, the vehicle could tip dangerously, even more so when loaded with passengers. Unlike modern SUVs with electronic stability control, the Polara had no system to prevent rollover or loss of control. It may not have looked like a top-heavy vehicle, but the combination of long overhangs, soft shocks, and slow-reacting steering created a dangerous formula. From the outside, the Polara appeared to be built like a tank, and many buyers assumed that size equaled safety. But that was an illusion. The chassis and body were not designed for crash energy absorption. They transferred much of the force to passengers. Lap-only seatbelts were still common. No airbags, no reinforced side panels, and no collapsible steering column in most models. In a high-speed impact, all that mass didn't help. It actually worked against the vehicle, increasing force and injury potential for occupants. Number 2, the 1946 Chevrolet Fleetmaster, a car that holds historical significance as one of the first American vehicles produced after World War II. While its return to the civilian market was greeted with excitement, especially by buyers eager to own something new after wartime production halts, the Fleetmaster represented a troubling truth. Automotive safety hadn't advanced at all. Though marketed as modern and stylish, the 1946 Fleetmaster was, under the skin, essentially a 1941 car with a fresh grille. And in a world where speed limits were rising, traffic was growing, and road infrastructure was expanding, the Fleetmaster's primitive safety features made it a hazard in post-war America. The Fleetmaster was built at a pivotal moment in American automotive history. After World War II, civilian car production resumed in 1945 to 46. Automakers rushed to satisfy pent-up demand from consumers who hadn't seen a new car in years. Instead of investing in redesigns, most companies, including Chevrolet, simply revived pre-war tooling, often with minimal changes. The 1946 Fleetmaster was Chevrolet's top trim level, boasting chrome accents and plush interiors. But structurally, it was a holdover from the early 1940s. Built in an era when crash survivability wasn't even on the radar. One of the most glaring flaws of the 1946 Fleetmaster was its fragile body structure, particularly in side impacts. The car had no side impact beams, no structural door reinforcements, and thin steel panels. A collision from the side, even at modest speeds, could collapse the door into the passenger compartment. There was no energy-absorbing structure. The body panels would crumple or tear, not redirect or dissipate force. Passengers in the front or rear bench seats were completely exposed to intrusion in a T-bone crash, and there was nothing like modern crumple zones or reinforced frames to protect them. The Fleetmaster used four-wheel drum brakes, which were the norm at the time, but they were poorly ventilated and had several shortcomings. Brake fade was a serious issue, especially on long descents or in repeated stop-and-go driving. In wet weather, braking performance could degrade rapidly. The stopping distance from 40 to 50 miles per hour was shockingly long by today's standards, and drivers had to allow extra space to avoid collisions. In emergency situations, the brakes simply lacked the power and reliability needed, particularly when the car was fully loaded with passengers. Another often overlooked hazard was the Fleetmaster's poor exterior lighting and limited driver visibility. Headlights were dim, with incandescent bulbs that offered limited road illumination, especially dangerous on rural or unlit roads. Brake lights were small and faint, making it difficult for following drivers to react in time. Rear and side visibility was compromised by thick roof pillars and small mirrors, which weren't adequate for lane changes or tight maneuvering. As a result, even basic night driving carried a higher risk, not from speed or recklessness, but from low visibility and poor illumination. Like nearly all vehicles of the era, the Fleetmaster had no safety systems to protect occupants in a crash. No seatbelts. These wouldn't become optional in American cars until the late 1950s and standard in the 1960s. No padded dashboards. The dash was solid metal, making any forward impact a potentially fatal event. No collapsible steering column. In a frontal collision, the steering shaft could impale the driver. No head restraints or energy-absorbing seats. The basic physics of a crash, forward momentum and force, were ignored in design, and the car offered zero occupant restraint. Despite all of these risks, the 1946 Fleetmaster sold well. Why? Its aerodynamic-looking fastback profile and glitzy trim evoke the optimism of post-war America. Buyers were less concerned with safety. They were mesmerized by design and availability. There was no consumer safety movement at the time, and crash testing didn't exist in any meaningful form. But what looked futuristic on the outside hid a dangerous truth inside. The Fleetmaster was a stylistic update on a dangerously outdated platform. The Fleetmaster is important not just for what it was, but for what it lacked, and how it symbolizes a pre-safety era in American car design. No structural integrity in a crash, no regard for occupant survival, no accountability from manufacturers. It would take decades and countless injuries and deaths before government regulation forced automakers to prioritize crashworthiness, restraint systems, and structural safety. Number 1. 1969 Ford Galaxie 500. By 1969, the American automotive landscape was awash in massive cruisers with long hoods, wide tracks, and V8 power. The Ford Galaxie 500 fit the mold perfectly, promising comfort, space, and effortless highway driving. But behind its confident presence lurked serious engineering oversights, particularly in crash safety, restraint systems, and interior ergonomics. Today, we'll dissect why this big car, though stylish and comfortable, was alarmingly dangerous in real-world accidents. The Galaxie 500 was nearly 18 feet long, with a body-on-frame chassis and heavy steel panels. At first glance, it might seem robust, even tank-like, but the reality was quite different. The frame offered little deformation control in crashes. The body shell had limited crumple zones, a concept that was still not fully embraced in American cars. Side impact protection was nearly non-existent, with thin doors and no internal bracing. This meant that in a collision, particularly from the side or front quarter, the occupant compartment could collapse dangerously, especially at speeds over 30 miles per hour. One of the Galaxie's most notorious features was its dashboard design, which represented a tragic misunderstanding of safety. The dashboard was entirely made of metal, with hard, pointed chrome trim. Knobs and protruding controls could impale or lacerate occupants in a crash. The steering column was not fully collapsible, meaning in a frontal collision, the column could be driven into the driver's chest. This was an era when padded surfaces and energy-absorbing structures were only beginning to be considered. In the Galaxie 500, style still took precedence over survival. Even by 1969, when mounting safety data had begun to influence design, the Galaxie 500's restraint systems were behind the curve. Seat belts were basic lap belts, often without retractors. In many models, belts were optional, and even when installed, they were awkward to use and rarely worn. There were no shoulder harnesses in most trims, and no pretensioners or inertia reels, features that were beginning to appear in safer European designs. This left occupants entirely vulnerable to secondary collisions within the cabin, hitting the steering wheel, dashboard, or windshield with full force. Unlike unibody cars with integrated crumple zones, the Galaxie 500 used a ladder-type frame, which transmitted crash forces directly into the cabin. In a head-on collision, the frame rails could buckle upward, forcing the engine and firewall back toward the front seats. The doors often jammed after impact, making escape difficult or impossible without outside assistance. In rollover accidents, increasingly common with wide, heavy sedans, the roof lacked structural rigidity, putting passengers at serious risk of crush injuries. This made the Galaxie 500 a nightmare scenario in real-world crashes, despite its size suggesting otherwise. Adding to the danger, the Galaxie 500 had mechanical systems that were barely adequate for its bulk. Four-wheel drum brakes on base models offered poor stopping power, especially when hot or under load. Brake fade was common, particularly during extended downhill driving or emergency stops. The steering was vague and slow, with significant body roll in corners. Emergency maneuverability was poor. The car could not be counted on to avoid a collision, only to survive one, and even that was questionable. The Galaxie 500 was designed for straight-line cruising, not dynamic control, a flaw that became clear in high-traffic environments. What makes the 1969 Galaxie 500 particularly frustrating is that the safety revolution was already underway. Volvo had introduced the three-point seatbelt in 1959. Mercedes and Saab were experimenting with crumple zones and safety cages. The U.S. government had passed the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act in 1966, beginning to regulate safety standards. But instead of innovating, Ford recycled dangerous interior designs, delayed implementation of meaningful seatbelt technology, and continued to prioritize comfort and styling over occupant protection.